After the death of Wotton, both Max and John continued to live in their new apartment. It wasn't ideal, and they both missed their own lives back in Moselstraat. It was, though, quiet and uneventful. John had been offered a job through the social services in Tavern. They had found him in a position working for a restaurant in the centre of Brussels. It would be general duties in the restaurant, and John would have the chance to develop a new career. He was excited about this. It would be his chance to work in the centre of the city, and he would also be supported by the social services network, which gave him a degree of support. For Max, he could see another John developing, someone who was moving back to a normal way of life. He was happy for his friend and thought this would be a great opportunity. There was one minor problem that wasn't serious but made Max wonder how his friend would be able to cope in a restaurant environment. John had started to have epileptic seizures. They weren't severe and only happened occasionally. He had noticed them soon after they had moved into their new apartment. They had started with John suddenly standing still and staring into space. He would stay like that for only a few minutes and then would snap out of it. Max didn't really think anything of it. Over the next few weeks, the epileptic seizures would come more often and would happen at any time. They could happen in the street, or in a bar, or at home. Max never knew when they would occur. Max began to realize there was a problem. John would go into his usual epileptic spasms and freeze. His mouth would be clamped shut, and he would collapse to the floor. Thankfully, Max had had an epileptic friend when he was growing up, so he knew the signs and he knew what to do. The usual advice was to place someone or something in the mouth to stop the person biting their tongue. With John's seizures, he couldn't open his mouth, so he had to make sure that he did not hurt himself. He soon realized what had happened when John would freeze and then pass out. He began to realize that all he could do was quickly take hold of John and gently lower him to the ground. He would then hold him in his arms and make sure that he didn't hurt himself. After about 10 minutes, the seizures would pass and John would come around. He would be dazed and confused and appeared not to remember anything. Max realized that he would have to give his friend time to recover and come round. With these seizures, these epileptic seizures, thankfully, John never hurt himself and would quickly recover without any damage to himself. In fact, it was surprising that he didn't even realize that he had a seizure. Max was becoming used to this and quickly learned to spot the signs. He didn't mind having to look after John. After all, it wasn't John's fault. But it did show that his brain damage was there, and however much he wanted to convince himself that John was recovering and becoming his normal self, the truth was that he was not recovering, and that each seizure appeared to affect him, especially his memory. His memory was getting worse, and each epileptic seizure appeared to leave its mark. Regardless of his condition, John was determined to take up his job in the restaurant. This was his chance to get back to a normal life and earn some money. After a few weeks, he was beginning to settle into his new routine, and everything was going well. He was doing a variety of tasks, and although his main job was working in the kitchen, he enjoyed this. John always loved cooking, and so the chance to work in a professional kitchen doing the things he loved was ideal. He really enjoyed it, and what is more, he was getting paid for it. He was happy. For Max, he was still concerned about his health, but as long as he was happy, then that was okay with him. There was no problem. Things appeared to be working out for them both. John had been working in the restaurant for a few weeks, perhaps a couple of months, when he arrived home early one afternoon. Max was working away at his laptop and was surprised when the door of the apartment opened and John appeared. Normally he'd be home about 6 p.m., but not this early. Max looked up from what he was doing and John was standing in the doorway of the lounge. He was covered in blood. "Oh my God," said Max, looking at him. "What happened?" John walked unsteadily into the lounge and dropped onto the sofa. He didn't say anything. Max stood up from the table where he was working and went over to him. "John, what happened?" he asked again. "I had a seizure in the restaurant," he said. "I don't remember much. They found me on the floor of the kitchen." He held out his hands. There were burn marks on the hands and on his arms. John just looked dazed. Max took his arms and looked at them. "I had a seizure in the kitchen and fell over on the stove," he sounding dazed. "What happened? Did they do anything?" Max asked. "They took me to the hospital and the doctors took care of me," he replied. "Then they left me there." Max wasn't understanding. "Okay, someone from the restaurant took you to the hospital and then they just left you there?" John nodded. I was there on my own." Max couldn't believe this. Someone in the restaurant, knowing that John had injured himself, had just left him there. They had just left him in a hospital in the center of Brussels and then gone back to work. "So what happened then?" asked Max. I came home," John said. "I walked across the city and got the metro. I just wanted to go home." Max looked at him again. John's eyes looked at him, and he could see that he was distressed. "I don't believe this," Max said. "Someone just left you alone to make your way across the city to take public transport. On your own. They left you alone in this state." John just nodded. Max was furious. "Look," he said, "we need to clean you up, John. I'll draw a warm bath and then you can wash yourself. You can wash this blood off and then I'll make you something to eat. Is that okay?" John looked at him and nodded. "Okay," said Max, "I'll do it. You just stay here and I'll let you know when it's ready." With that, he disappeared into the bathroom and started pouring the water. He put some bath liquid into the water and it began to foam. Max was angry. He was furious. How could someone do this to John? How could someone working in a restaurant just leave him like this to find his own way home across the city on his own? Who were these people? Did they not care? Didn't anyone care? Following a complaint to the social services and a report from John's doctor, he was finally declared as being disabled and unable to work. This meant that John didn't have to be responsible for finding a job anymore, and he also got an allowance from the Belgian state. Max was happy, although it meant that John would never work again. Well, certainly not in the near future. They both found themselves at home. Max had some part-time projects to work on, which kept him occupied, and John appeared happy to spend his time on social media chatting with people around the world. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best that they could do. John was happier now than he had been for a long time. Kurt was still visiting occasionally and would still take him out to the supermarket to fill up the kitchen with groceries. It was August, and in Belgium it was a warm, humid summer. Max woke one morning and went into the lounge. John was lying on one of the sofas. "You okay?" he said casually. "I didn't sleep well last night," said John. I don't feel well." "Okay," replied Max, heading for the kitchen. "Maybe you've got a bug or something. Maybe it was something you ate." John nodded. I need to go to the toilet." With that, he pulled himself off the sofa and headed for the bathroom. Max headed into the kitchen to make himself his first cup of coffee. After a while, the coffee was made, and he went back into the lounge and sat down to watch the early morning news. He heard a dull thud from the bathroom. He didn't think anything about it. It just sounded as though John had knocked something off the counter. He sat there and continued drinking his coffee and watching the news. Something told him there was something wrong. He put his mug down and went to the bathroom door and knocked. There was no answer. "John," he asked, "are you okay?" Still no answer. He pulled open the bathroom door and John was lying face down on the floor. Max immediately thought that he'd had another epileptic seizure. He made his way over and, as usual, cradled John in his arms. "It's okay, John," he said. "I'm here. You're okay. Just breathe, John. Just breathe." There was no sign for him. No groan. No clenched teeth. Nothing. "John?" Max asked, moving him and laying him gently on the bathroom floor. "John, wake up." There was no response. He felt down to his face, but John wasn't breathing. His eyes were half closed and there was no movement, no breathing, no nothing. Max shook him for a few minutes, expecting him to wake up from the seizure. There was nothing, no movement, no breathing. Max began to panic and started shaking him. "John, wake up," he cried. "Wake up, John. Wake up. It's okay, John. It's okay." There was no response. Max was now in a panic. He didn't know what to do. He left John and went upstairs to the apartment above him. He knew the lady in the apartment above him and they had become good neighbors. He also knew that she spoke English well and she'd been a nurse. He knocked on her door. Slowly, she answered. He explained what had happened and asked her to come down to the apartment. He explained that there was something wrong, something seriously wrong. Grabbing her key, she rushed down with him. As soon as she saw John lying in the bathroom floor, she started to examine him. "He's not breathing," she said. "Give me your phone." Max disappeared into the lounge and found his phone. Back in the bathroom, he gave it to her. She immediately rang the emergency number. In fluent Dutch, she spoke to the operator and gave them instructions. She turned off the phone and handed it back to Max. Bring him into the hall," she ordered. Together they pulled him from the floor and out into the hall where there was more room. She started to give him CPR. "Go downstairs," she said. "Wait for the ambulance in the street. Bring them here straight away." Max did what she said and ran down into the street in the front of the apartment block. 10 minutes later, there was the sound of an ambulance turning the street corner and heading in his direction. He waved at them, and they pulled up sharply near to him. He directed the medics into the apartment block and up to his apartment. They were quick, running up the short flight of stairs. As soon as they arrived, they took over, pumping John's heart, giving him mouth to mouth. They worked frantically while Max and his neighbor just stood to one side and watched. They tried again and again to get his heart started, but with no luck. They brought in a machine that would pump his heart, but nothing worked. John was dead. Max looked down at him, lying on the floor, realizing that there was nothing he could do. He was dead. John was dead. It had happened so quickly. Only an hour ago they'd been chatting. Now the medics were declaring him dead. It had happened so quickly. It was early afternoon before Max had the courage to call Kurt. He had to tell him. At first Kurt didn't understand. "John's dead?" he asked over and over again. "Yes," replied Max. He was now in shock. He didn't know what to do or what to say. Can you come over?" he asked. "I'll come over as soon as I can," replied Kurt and hung up. Max put his phone down and looked around the lounge. It was quiet. His neighbor had gone back to her apartment. The ambulance had taken John away to the hospital. He was alone. Max was alone. "John," he kept saying to himself. "John, I promise, John. I promised I'd never leave you alone, John. He started to cry. The funeral was arranged for the following week. John was to be cremated locally. Kurt had made the arrangements and had contacted a few friends and invited them to the ceremony. There was also an old school friend of John's who had managed to contact, and he was flying in specially. Kurt would pick up Max from his apartment and the two of them would go together. The service was quiet and respectful. It wasn't a particularly Christian funeral, as Kurt had brought them together and thought because of John's lack of belief he wouldn't want a priest to be there. There were a few words spoken. Kurt made a speech and another of John's friends stood up and said something. Max sat there in silence. He was numb. He felt nothing. He listened to other people talking without registering what they said. He was polite, welcoming, and thanked people for coming. He was making small talk after the service, but he really wasn't there. Afterwards, they went back to a friend's apartment and they had drinks and sandwiches. He tried to join in, but it was as if everyone else was talking, saying something that he couldn't understand. Even Kurt appeared to be chatting, but Max could see there was a stillness to him, a distance as well. Later, after they had finished, Kurt drove him back to the apartment and left him. Max entered the silent apartment and looked around. John's things were still here. His smartphone was still on the sofa. His clothes were still hanging in the wardrobe. He had not the heart to touch anything. Max took off his suit and hung it up in his bedroom. He put on a dressing gown and went into the lounge. He would watch something on TV tonight. Perhaps there was an old movie on later that would keep his attention. He was alone. For now and forever. He was alone. The following day, a woman turned up at his door. She was carrying a flower-covered cardboard box. She explained that inside were John's ashes. She handed the box to Max and left. He took the box and put it on the sideboard in the lounge. It was like a wine box. He smiled to himself. "Look, John," he said to an empty room. "You've come home in a wine box." There was no reply, only silence. He had to decide what to do with his ashes, with John's ashes. Kurt had made some suggestions. John's family weren't interested. No one was really interested in where John would finally lay his head. There was only Max. So, early one morning he dressed early. The summer sun was only just beginning to rise. He took the box and opened it. Inside was a metal canister with a screw lid. He took the canister out of the box and looked at it. It was John's ashes. He knew where to go. He knew where John would want to be. Putting his jacket on, he took the canister and walked out of the apartment into the street. He was heading towards the lake. It was early and the streets were empty. Ahead he could see someone walking their dog, but apart from that, the town was silent. It was still early. He walked along the street holding the canister to his chest. It would be the last time he and John would walk together along this street. As he walked along the street, he talked to John, reminding him of places and people they had known. Eventually he reached the side of the lake on the edge of the town. The sun was now slowly rising above the horizon, and there was a gentle morning mist covering the lake. Soon it would be gone, and the warm summer heat would rise, but for now, the mist hovered above the water. Max walked with the canister along the narrow path that led the way around the lake. He stopped at one spot at the side of the lake, covered in trees. The sun was high enough now to show a ray of light which fell on a patch behind a clump of trees. Max looked around. There was no one there. He didn't want to see anyone. He didn't want to share this moment with anyone. It would just be him and John together for the last time. Just them. Alone. Sure that no one was watching, he unscrewed the lid of the canister. Inside were John's ashes. He walked off the path and into the undergrowth between the trees. He didn't need to go far. Just where the light was breaking through the branches of the trees. Using a long sweeping motion, he emptied John's ashes onto the ground. There you are, John, he said in a quiet voice. I told you I would take care of you. You're even close to the town, near to home. This is where you can rest. He screwed the top back on the canister and made his way back to the path. As he walked back, he looked over his shoulder. I told you I would look after you, John. I promised. I promised I would never leave you. Max Carter stopped typing and sat back for a second. Reaching forward, he turned off the laptop and closed the lid. Outside it was growing dark and the street lights had come on. There was a gentle rain falling now, and 1 or 2 people were heading home beneath his window. He had done it. He had told the story of John. For Max there was nothing more to say. He didn't know or even care if anyone would read it or listen to his story. He didn't care if they would like it or not. He had done it for himself. He had done it for John. The lounge was getting dark, so he turned on the sidelight at the edge of his desk. It filled a part of the room with a warm light. Max leaned back again further into his chair and stretched. He'd been writing this story for a long time, and his muscles were now stiff. Old age was creeping up on him. Pulling himself up from his chair, he stretched again. His back was stiff, and he had to hold on to the arms of the chair. Standing up, he stretched again. Woti, he called out to an empty room. Ah, my poor aching bones, Woti. My poor aching bones. Oh. In his imagination, he could see a large black dog standing next to him, looking up at him. He put his hand down as if to stroke him. Max moved away from his laptop and the desk. It was done. Now, he needed a beer. He looked across, and the night was falling. He was alone again. Pulling himself up and stretching, he went into the kitchen and found the fridge. In the fridge was a normal collection of beers. He took one out. I need a beer, John, he said, and closed the fridge door.